Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our session on how to remove barriers and change hiring for the better. 2020 has been a year of uncomfortable changes with businesses closing down or struggling to survive, millions of people out of work, and having to be physically distant from people in a way that we've never had to do before. So then on top of that, there were riots and protests in the US exposing problems of equality and discrimination that are far from solved. All that to say, change is uncomfortable, but change can also be good. Today, we'll look at positive changes you can make in your business to identify blind spots, remove barriers, and revise some of the hiring practices that may be undercutting your diversity efforts. I have 4 great guests joining me today. You can see their smiling faces there on your screen. I can't wait to introduce them to you, so we'll get to that in just a second. Again, I'd like to say thank you for being here. Today we're going to get into some hard truths. So maybe you don't leave the session feeling quite as zen as the guy here on the slide, but I do hope that by exposing barriers and helping to show how the process and the outcomes of hiring can actually be better without them, that you can start to pave the best path for your people and your company. My name is Brianna Harper, and I'm your webinar host. I'm also your resource for any questions you have during the session or anytime after. We've planned about 30 minutes for our discussion today. After that, I'd like to open it up for Q&A. So I'd love to hear questions you have and insight on how you're navigating some of these issues. So feel free to type in questions anytime something comes into mind. After the session, I'll send out a link to the slide deck and the recording. If you have any questions that we don't get to today or that you think of after the session, please reach out to me. You can email me at bharper@outmatch.com, or you can find me on social at OutMatchHCM. So now I'll let you hear from the real stars of the show. Like I said, you can see their faces here on your webcam, and you can see who they are on the slide, but I'd love to just go around the room and have each of them tell us a little bit more about yourselves. So Connor, welcome. Tell us about you.
Hi, yeah, so can you hear me?
Yeah.
Right. Thank God. We were talking about how terrifying it is to be on a new video conferencing tool. It's so stressful, but I'm glad you all can hear me. And yeah, such an honor to be here. Want to thank OutMatch for pulling this together. I lead an organization called Merit America, and we're focused on preparing low-wage workers for skilled careers at scale. And a big part of this is opening up new, more diverse talent pipelines, alternative talent pipelines, which OutMatch has been an incredible supporter of and enabler of with its tools. So really excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm personally a big fan of Merit America, so I'm really excited to have your perspective and your thoughts on this topic. Jason, over to you.
Yeah, thanks again for having us. I'll echo Connor's feedback there. He's putting this together in a way that I really enjoy, and getting all like-minded people together to be able to talk about some important topics and some crazy topics here with all the things that you mentioned there that are affecting all of us. And it's just affecting us in our personal life, but also in our careers and how we're managing our people, how we're running organizations. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer for BountyJobs. So we're a vendor management platform and a marketplace that really helps employers and those third-party agencies that they work with come together. We've been doing it for 13 years. We tend to have a lot of data in this space. So we do a lot of these, and we put a lot of thought leadership out there. So I look forward to the discussion. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. I'm glad to have you. Robin, over to you.
Hi, I'm Robin Stenzel. I'm the Chief Solutions Officer at OutMatch. I often get asked, what is that? It's really just a catch-all for all of the things that don't fall specifically into another executive. That's what I work on. But I get to work some with our customers, our product team, so excited about that. But my background is really as an HR practitioner. So I've spent most of my career in a talent spot, either leading talent for global organizations, acting as an HR generalist, and a variety of roles like that. So excited to be here, really passionate about this topic. So thanks for including me.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. And Emo, over to you.
Thank you, Brianna. So yeah, my name is Emo Udom. I'm the Chief Strategy and Chief Product Officer at OutMatch. Basically, I really think about how we can use OutMatch's products to help our mission, right? And at OutMatch, one of the big things we're trying to do is match people with purpose. From a personal perspective, I've been in the HR technology space for over 10 years. And really, I've always wanted to find ways that we can do business so that our business can be profitable while still helping people, right? How can we just create businesses where the business wins, but that's not at the expense of people losing? And so that's been a passion of mine, and it's great to kind of look at that from a different lens when we focus on HR technology, and people and hiring. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you, Emo. All right, so really quick before we begin, I just wanted to give you a peek at what's coming next in our Future of Work series. So next month, we're going to look at how to transform hiring without changing your ATS. So we know there are a lot of things about how hiring is done that isn't ideal, but making changes in your ATS or replacing your ATS can be an expensive multi-year project. So in this session, we're going to look at creative ways to think outside the stack and solve some common process problems without having to overhaul everything. So I hope to see you back next month for that one. And one last thing, today's session is valid for 1 professional development credit for the SHRM CP or the SHRM SCP. So look for that activity ID from me at the end of the webinar. All right, I'm really excited to dive into this topic, but I want to start by just getting a pulse of everyone we have on the call today. So I'm going to launch a quick poll so that we can better understand where your diversity challenges and barriers might be. So I'm going to pop this out quickly, and if you guys could just put your answers in, that's going to help us really tailor the conversation to the parts of the process that are most interesting to you. All right, I see answers coming in. In just a few seconds, I'll close this out and share the results with everyone. But I'll say it looks like A, sourcing, is leading the way so far. So if you haven't voted yet, please hop in there, put in your answer, and we'll be able to speak to that. All right, let me close this down and share the results. All right, we've got 56% for sourcing, 29% seeing drop off in the recruitment process, 12% concerned about turnover among new hires, and 4% voted for something else. So I'll look and see what other answers we got in there. Robin, is this what you expect to see? Is this what you've seen, in some of your roles in the past?
Yeah, it's very much, it's not a surprise, I would say. I think really that idea of sourcing. So, if you think about it, and if you're sitting in a recruiter seat, right, you've got a lot of different things on your plate, and one of those becomes sourcing, and it's easy to rely on some of our traditional sourcing systems that probably bring us sort of the same types of candidates over and over again. So no surprises there. I am curious a little bit on the drop off in the recruitment process. If that's something that's part of the process is pulling people out, or are people pulling themselves out? That one is kind of an interesting one, maybe to explore a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of you who voted for B, seeing drop off in the recruitment process, if you want to chat in and tell us what that means to you, that's certainly something that we can talk to in the webinar today. So let's get going. All right, the first thing we're going to do is talk about the first barrier. So let's start with a barrier that is such a common requirement for professional jobs that most employers don't even think twice about it. And that's the 4-year college degree requirement. So Connor, I'd love to throw this over to you. Can you talk about the impact that this has on diversity and what Merit America is doing to help people without 4-year degrees overcome this barrier? Oh, Connor, I think you're muted. Of course.
Of course I'm muted. Okay.
It was amazing. Whatever you said was amazing.
It was so good. I'd like to rest there, actually. I don't think I need to say anything. it's really interesting when you think about discrimination in hiring and how this is so front of mind for business leaders across the country. And yet how rarely we talk about other more silent, pernicious forms of discrimination, like bachelor's discrimination. And I think that bachelor's degree discrimination is so dangerous, not only because it correlates so strongly with other forms of discrimination, but because it's so socially acceptable. It's kind of like a backdoor way for people to stoke their biases. You know, I think of this actually similar to our criminal justice system. So I volunteer teach at a local jail here in San Francisco, and I'm just amazed at how socially acceptable it is to discriminate against people who have some sort of a record, and how coincidentally that just also happens to align often with lines of race and socioeconomic status, which it gives, again, this backdoor pathway to discriminate and indulge these darker sides of ourselves. And it really is a corollary with racial discrimination. When employers across the country say that we're only going to hire people with a 4-year degree, they are automatically cutting out 80% plus of Latinx working adults. They're automatically cutting out 70% of Black Americans. And again, it's socially acceptable. Everyone does it. We have billions of dollars of an industry focused on vetting talent and these infrastructures that are just so well designed, so well structured that systematically vet out candidates who have all the skills they need to succeed, but don't have the right stamp from a university. In terms of what we're doing at Merit America, I think there are a few things. One is that we are arming our learners with the skills that they need to succeed, and not discriminating against them for not having a 4-year degree. We are looking for learners who have the grit, the perseverance, the cognitive skills. Is one of the reasons why we love OutMatch so much. And then aligning their skills, training them, coaching them to make them job ready for a life-changing career. That's kind of the bottoms-up way we're approaching this. The more tops-down is that we're working with top employers in the world, employers like Amazon, Infosys, HCL, JP Morgan Chase, Google, just really inspiring employers who carry real weight in this sector. And we're working with them to change these practices and hoping that they will act as the vanguard in this movement to stop this widespread discrimination. So those are a few thoughts.
Yeah, so you mentioned the employers that you're working with that are kind of excited to usher in this new way and get rid of some of that, some of the glaring discrimination that you mentioned. What is really the blocker for other organizations then? Is it just that they haven't seen this done yet? Really, what are the challenges you see there for companies removing that barrier?
I think I'm okay, and I'm not muted. I think there are a few things. I think first, a big part of this is just it's inertia. You have these massive organizations that have done things a certain way for several decades, and it's hard to turn that ship. I really empathize with that. I think it can be easy for us to say, hey, just do it, make it happen, but there are deeply entrenched behaviors and also tools that people use to do this. The other thing is that, like many forms of discrimination, it makes things really easy. I mean, it does help, help identify talent to say, we're just going to forget these thousands of other applicants because we have this proxy that actually does work, right? But that's true for a lot of proxies. So to put this into context, imagine 20 years from now, we tell them, hey, we used to discriminate against people who had a 4-year degree. I think it would be the same. It would feel the same 20 years from now as it would be if someone came to us and said, oh yeah, we only hire people who come from wealth. We hire people who are in the top 5% because that actually correlates really well with job performance. They ascend the ranks really well. it's actually it's no different. The only difference is that there's more charge around that. We're saying, oh, that's unfair. That's like, that's actually not aligned with what they need, what matters on the job, and you're cutting out all these other people. And then the businesses might say, yeah, that's true, but it's good talent, it's reliable talent, it's a reliable proxy. So I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, everything you're saying makes so much sense. And I'd like to throw this out to the rest of the panel because you said hiring the way it is easy, and it makes sense. These proxies actually help kind of move things along. So is there anything any of you would add to that in terms of why companies are operating this way today?
Yeah, so I'm going to maybe tee this up a little bit for, I guess, Robin and Jason, but from what I hear as I engage with a lot of, recruiters, talent acquisition professionals over the years, it's exactly what Connor said. It's sometimes I'm getting such an influx of candidates, I just need something that's going to help me reduce that funnel. And it's a proxy, and it's correlated oftentimes to people that I think are successful or not. So whether that's true or not, I think one of the challenges that companies will have is if I remove that, I'm going to get significantly more applicants, and I can't handle that volume. Now, I think there are ways to solve for that, but that's one of the things that I hear from customers and people in the space.
Yeah, and I agree with both points of view here. And one thing that was really interesting, I've been blessed to, pre-COVID, to do a lot of guest speaking, a lot of it publicly, and that also allows me to interact with a lot of people in the audience and get their feedback. This concept of barriers in hiring was slightly different before COVID because of the war on talent and because it was so hard to find talent. I was very encouraged. Now, again, I don't have a data point kind of during COVID, but as we brought this up in a lot of our surveys and topics, we saw a lot of companies, and to Connor's point, I don't think they were this megalithic battleships who are going to take a long time to turn, but there was a lot of mid-sized and even large companies who had TA, and talent acquisition is very much trying to become strategic and not administrative as they used to be in the past. So they've been pushing the organization because the top of the funnel was so narrow on qualified talent that they didn't need that proxy gating function of that additional 4-year degree, that they were pushing back on the organization, the hiring manager, saying, potentially not for the reasons we want them to get rid of it, but they just needed to open that aperture at the top of the funnel. So that I saw maybe 30 or 40% of the organizations I spoke to there's certain jobs where you have to have that, right? But outside of that, they were really looking at that as either the 4-year degree or relevant experience. And that is a big change in the last 10 years. I don't know how COVID has affected that. What I do know is COVID has changed our entire world overnight, from everything from the top of the funnel sourcing all the way down to onboarding and talent management. So I maintained my point of pre-COVID that I'm very encouraged by what I'm seeing, at least in that mid-size organization.
That's a great point.
Yeah,
it's good for business.
And that's how you get change. A lot of times we think social change is the right change, and it is the right change. But a lot of times what we have to do, those of us who are trying to push for that social change, is make the business case for that social change. And as long as that change happens and has the right impacts, then we've done our job.
Yeah. Sorry, Robin, I cut you off.
No, not at all. I think, one point I just would I agree with everything everyone has said. I would add one point, being in an organization and sort of this requirement, and I apologize if you get the echo of my 4-legged coworker who's being really loud right now. But I think the thing that ends up happening, and I think it's an unconscious bias, which is hiring managers put things together because it's like me. So I don't think that in some cases that there's this intentional screen out. They certainly aren't considering, hey, recruiter, how do you get fewer? Because they actually want more. We would tell you like fewer and more quality is better than a lot and not a lot of quality. But that sort of falls deaf ears, because if I don't see everybody in a big pool, then I'm going to miss something. Sometimes becomes, you might hear that from your hiring managers. But then as they start to influence those descriptions, it's, well, this is how I grew up in this industry. I had a 4-year degree, or I had a certain experience. I think we had this conversation around military, and what you find is people who've been in the military really kind of can gravitate towards others and see their skill sets and translate them and are much more open to that experience, versus other people who will say, I want to hire military, like veterans, but then look at a veteran resume and don't understand how to translate that, and struggle to see where those differences are. So I think this idea comes from sometimes of unconsciously, how do I create something because I feel like I'm successful and I want more people like me?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Go ahead.
Because I think it's important to put it in context for people. Because for those of us who are trying to do change, and let's say you're on the talent acquisition side or talent management side, and you're trying to push the organization, you have to be able to boil this down to brass tacks of what's impactful for the business. So let's say you had 2 salespeople, 2 resumes, because we know sales affects the bottom line of companies, and most people can kind of see that correlation. And you had somebody who was a valedictorian from Harvard, and you had somebody who didn't have a college degree. And then you looked at the resume, and they've both been salespeople for a decade, and the one who went to Harvard never hit quota, and the one who doesn't have a 4-year degree was always 150% of quota. As a hiring manager in an organization, which person would you rather have, and who's going to be more impactful to your business? And those are the types of questions you need to push back. Our job in the talent acquisition, push back on the organization, because chances are the person without the 4-year degree, if you can get rid of that bias, is going to be more impactful to the business.
Yeah.
I think if you can build that relationship too with your hiring managers, you're not even submitting the other one, right? Your hiring manager back to my hiring manager doesn't have to see 15. I can give them one really good one, and we have a relationship and a trust that I can go and do this, and so I don't have to even have to get through the other side of it.
To share one lived experience, just to really hit it home, if you have to have this conversation internally, right? Think about it. The 4-year degree, it just doesn't matter in every situation. There are people who were valedictorians in high school that unfortunately could not go to college because they got in, they got offer letters, they're ready to go to that Harvard, but had to stay home and work to take care of their family. That's a large percentage of America. People who are choosing not to go to college, even though they got in, even if they got into prestigious schools, because they have to take care of family members, they have to work. And so to have a barrier as a 4-year degree being the limiter, you know, as we move forward and change the way we work, it needs to start going away.
Yeah, thank you all of you for sharing those perspectives. I think that's a really important way to frame this as we talk through some of these barriers. Robin, I have a question for you because we're looking at the 4-year college degree requirement, which is really commonly seen in professional jobs. So what would you say is the equivalent or, you know, the biggest barrier in other spaces where there's a lot of hourly and entry-level hiring, restaurant, retail, banking, airlines? What are they facing that might be similar to what we're talking about here?
I think sometimes what can end up happening, and I think to Jason's point, sort of pre-COVID, we were seeing something a little bit different. I think we're starting to switch back again because we've got more candidates in there, which is this idea of industry experience, right? So if I want someone who's going to come in and work in my restaurant, I want them to have had previous restaurant, and it's specifically if it's, you know, fine dining, I want them to have fine dining experience, or if it's fast casual, I want them to come to that, because I'm very different. And I need to know that someone can come in and than anybody else, and how do I translate that? You know, so imagine now someone with service, you know, industry experience from, say, a restaurant applying for a job as a customer service rep at another organization. Sometimes we just don't see that translation. We often think our businesses are so unique. And so while you can't know my business because you haven't worked here, at least if you know my industry, then you would. So I think that becomes a challenge. It's an interesting challenge because if you think about it, it's by not sort of bringing in these different experiences, innovation and creativity and all these other things you sort of lose by not having someone who hasn't grown up in an industry say, wait, why do you do it that way? Right? Because if I came from another industry and I've always done it that way, I'm just going to keep doing this thing because that's what I'm conditioned to do. But that industry experience, I think there's a little bit of, and again, I think we saw people starting to think about this differently sort of pre-COVID, but this idea of translation of skills, and that can be hard for people to do. And back to the conversations of, even if you're, you know, a great recruiter and you understand how those skills translate, it can be hard sometimes to try and communicate and share that with a hiring manager. So really having to get clear on that.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because that's something we're going to get into in a little bit in the webinar, is how you actually do that translating when you break down some of these barriers. So let's keep moving. Emo, I'll throw this next question to you since we're talking about other barriers in other industries. What are some other common practices that are creating barriers to diversity?
Yes, great question. And, I think there are a lot of ways to jump into this. And I decided to take a little bit of science approach, but to really keep it human. I think one of the things we see in interviewing specifically is confirmation bias, right? We touched on this a little bit earlier, but oftentimes, very quickly in an interview or in a conversation, you latch onto something or you have a hypothesis about the individual, and then you've already made your decision. After that, you're looking for a way to just reconfirm what your gut or instinct sort of told you about that individual. And I think that really is a common thing that happens, right? As much as we try to do interview training and the like, it's human nature, right? You have a hypothesis, you trust your judgment, and then everything else around that is sort of skewing or just confirming what you thought about already. I think another one that's really important that happens around the decision-making and hiring as well is similar to what I just said, that's really conformity bias. And I'll use some stats here. So on the conformity bias side, a study was done about, just to put it in context, conformity bias is essentially groupthink, the peer pressure to conform to how others think. You can imagine that happening a lot when you're making a final decision on finalists, right? The hiring panel is coming together, you're saying, who do you like and who don't you like and why? So if you don't have a structured process for that, it's easy to gravitate towards conformity. And again, a study was done, it was not in hiring, it was actually done with researchers in a different context. But they had people select between two options. And then later they had them come together as a group and everyone picked the other option on purpose. And said about 75% of the time, that outlier individual changed their answer. 75% of the time, they changed their answer to something else because everyone else was going down that path. So again, think about that in the hiring process. Think about that as making that final decision around individuals. That can be a common practice that makes it really challenging for the hiring process.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I actually met Emo because he's the founder of one of the early video interviewing platforms called WePow, and OutMatch actually acquired this technology. And Emo, I love the story of your vision as you were kind of innovating in the space and creating this new technology. Can you just share that with everyone on the call?
Yeah, I'll share a bit of how we kind of approached what we're trying to do here. So the couple other things we heard a lot, I can't hire diverse talent because of speed. I'm trying to hire, I just don't have a pipeline sourcing, right? That came up early on. There's not enough people, not enough, the pipeline is short. Robin kind of brought up talking to hiring managers in an intake meeting, trying to figure out what is important to a role and maybe not being able to tease that out. So when we started,
I don't know if you saw it. Do you see the Wells Fargo CEO comment?
I did not.
The Wells Fargo CEO, I mean, he's under a lot of fire right now, but he came out saying exactly this. He said, there just aren't enough black candidates. We have a pipeline problem. And it's like, yeah, you have a pipeline problem, but you're also constricting the pipeline by saying you'll only hire black candidates with a 4-year degree. So I just wanted to add that that's very live right now. It's live and well.
Exactly. So, when we created WePow, part of what we're trying to achieve, or the way we're thinking is, look, people want to do the right thing. Oftentimes they want to, right? But there are things behind the scenes that are stopping them, the system, the pipeline, this, that, the third. We said, how can we remove a lot of those barriers? How can we take a systematic, or in our case, technological approach so we can take away all those excuses, for lack of a better term? So we thought if there was a way to create structured interviews, which if you go back to a lot of research, structured interviews are great ways to put people through a process and reduce the amount of bias in the process. So we said, can we productize a structured interview that's really consistent? Everyone gets the same questions, same time to think, same time to answer. We create a situation where different evaluators can evaluate that candidate on structured criteria. without seeing each other's responses? And then can we do all that very quickly so you can cast a wider net? So that was really some of the piece parts we were trying to achieve when we first came up with our recorded video interviewing solution. But exactly that. Let's help people do the right thing by creating systems and processes that scale for them, that eliminate a lot of those excuses. So cast a wider net, add more people in the funnel. The process is so quick anyway that you're not going to add a lot of extra time. And then because it's a structured process, we can try to reduce some of those biases.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I really like naming these biases, calling them out, just so that we're aware that all of this stuff is really happening unconsciously and kind of hidden below the surface. So I think we could spend a lot more time here, but I want to keep us moving. So let's get to this next question here. So we've looked at some of the early knockouts that eliminate candidates really early in the process. Things like lack of industry experience, the four-year college degree. And what's happened recently with this like overnight shift to remote work has really given us the opportunity to continue looking outside the box in a lot of ways. Until recently, where someone lived or their willingness to move would be potentially a knockout question for them. So I'd love to hear, and I'll start with you, Jason. Can you talk about how this is changing and how employers can really take advantage of this new trend?
Yeah, this is a big one for me. And some of this is just like in trading is speculation a little bit, but our industry in the HR tech space, but also just talent acquisition in general, has gone through maybe the last 10 years of a slow maturation process where here and there a person or a hiring manager is willing to let somebody be remote. Very certain positions, very certain set of criteria, very narrow aperture by which a lot of these people let that happen. What's really interesting about COVID is it sped up that process overnight, which would have taken at least a decade. So my background is in supply chain and procurement and understanding all this. So traditionally, for certainly our lifetime and our parents and our grandparents' lifetime, what has happened is people went to where the jobs were. If you wanted to work for Ford, you picked up and moved to Detroit. So, and even up till pre-COVID, if you were a company and you had two really good candidates, we'll call them Joe and Betty, and Betty was the best candidate, but Betty wasn't willing to reload, you would hire Joe. Right? And there'd be all these costs and all that associated. So now what is happening is the jobs are moving to where the candidates are. And there is an exorbitant amount of data supporting this. One great story is we all know who Pinterest is. Pinterest spent $89 million last month to break a lease in San Francisco, not to sign a lease. They spent nearly $90 million to break a lease, which means they had an entire executive team and lawyers look at that going, this probably makes more financial sense for us to do that. Another great story is, so in our world, we deal with a lot of employers and third-party agencies who are doing that social engineering. One of our customers who's in the Bay, their bias is if we're going to hire an engineer or anybody, you have to be in our office. So they're typically going to go pay somewhere between $225,000, $250,000 for a Java engineer, and they're going to pay, probably 20% of that in recruiter fees. And they're looking at a very small group of people, which is why, in a very competitive area, which is why that price goes up. So last month, they hired an engineer in Indianapolis for $155,000, right? And now everybody's happy. That person's happy because they're working for a Bay Area startup that they wanted to. They got the best talent for that job. That person didn't have to relocate. And what you're seeing, I think this is going to have a little bit of a tangent, huge macroeconomic impacts in our lifetime that will probably last our lifetime. San Francisco had the biggest drop in commercial real estate lease ever in history in a month. So what is happening is people are like San Francisco, New York, they're fleeing the cities because either they can go work somewhere else remotely and have a better cost of living where they end up going. We've seen all the stories of New York. So what is happening is I think you're having a bit of an exodus for companies and employees outside of cities because the entire supply chain has been disrupted just because of this. Literally because overnight, we used to have to go where the jobs were and now the jobs are coming to where we are. Now that's going to change things in our world from a sourcing perspective and from a candidate's perspective. So if you were a chief product officer in Austin, there may be 50 of you who are, top of the pyramid who are really good. Well, now that company who's based in Austin may have access to thousands of them. But the inverse is always, or the reverse is always true. You may be in Austin, but now you have access to significantly more jobs nationally and globally. So we all, as candidates, need to get used to this, as employers need to get used to it, but very specifically in our entire sourcing, TA, talent management, and hiring manager process, we need to understand that all this has changed overnight, and those people who get to codifying the process that's going to make the most sense the fastest are going to win this war on talent, because the war on talent that was there pre-COVID is going to come back very quickly as we come out of COVID as well.
Yeah, I thank you for that. And I really love having this conversation right now because we are in a moment that is changing very quickly. You know, from 6 months ago to 6 months from now, things are moving very fast. And, you know, some new things are available that weren't before, new ways of thinking for sure, because I think what you mentioned was that talent was always there and they actually did have access to it. They just weren't allowing themselves to think that way. So this is a really great time to kind of push through. So let's talk about one more barrier and then we'll really get into, you know, how to overcome some of this. So Connor, I'm going to come back to you on this one because you mentioned your work in the criminal justice system. So this is another barrier, like the four-year degree, that disproportionately impacts underrepresented groups. Can you talk about this barrier and how companies might rethink their policies on criminal backgrounds?
Yeah, I think that it varies so much depending on the industry and the role. I mean, you have, you know, government roles, for example, where they're doing random drug tests and, you know, the smallest infractions can hold you back. And then you have Silicon Valley where it's, you know, you get in trouble if you're not on drugs, you know, everyone. So I think there's a wide spectrum, and I think understanding where it, you know, fits in and how it changes in these different sectors and in these different regions. But, you know, it's really no different than what we're talking about here with bachelor's degree discrimination as well. You know, thinking about how are these vetting mechanisms actually relevant to the roles that we're hiring for, and where are they doing more harm than good? And I'd argue that most jobs you don't need. I think most jobs or most companies that are vetting people for a criminal background, I think they tend to be much harsher and more restrictive than they need to be. And so in doing that, there are these externalities where they're discriminating against many people of color.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Anything anyone wants to add before we move on to, you know, what's next?
Yeah, just one thing I'd like to add, you know, when we think about COVID specifically and the impact it may have on some of the hiring process, gaps in employment is something that's going to be interesting, right? I think there's always this underlying tension that if someone has a gap in employment, that's a negative. You know, COVID is definitely going to cause an increase in the number of people with gaps in employment. And so how are we in talent acquisition going to react to that, right? And so I think that's an interesting thing that I plan to kind of stay connected to and understand, because yeah, everyone's going to have, or many people are going to have gaps in employment, and what was in their control versus not in their control. And then when we think about how that may impact individuals versus when we consider male, female, or genders of people going on leave, family leave, right? That's a natural gap. So now does this start to help people be more open to leave versus gaps in employment that were you chose or forced on you? So again, that's just something I think will be interesting to watch and monitor.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Robin.
I was gonna say, I think the other thing that kind of, a little bit of what Jason and Connor said that sort of ties together is this idea of organizations now saying, I'm going to look at talent in different ways. And so certainly tech makes sense. But then when you start to think about things like, you know, I came from very much field organizations, which are like manufacturing and retail and airlines, which have been very traditional. Even at the corporate office, it has to look like the field, right? So the idea kind of entered drug testing, right? So even if you're working in a corporate setting, you're going to get drug tested like you're operating heavy machinery. right? And so those kinds of things. And as we start to think about it, but then I think if you look at some of those industries, they are the most in need of innovation. And so to kind of get outside of this back to either industry experience or sort of this traditional, you must be in this city, sitting in this seat, in this organization, I think COVID has had them even really start to think, at least as I talk to my friends and colleagues who are still there, really starting to think, I maybe don't have to treat these things the same. I don't have to make my corporate headquarters or certain offices have the same restrictions that maybe, you know, look, I can't manufacture something if someone's not on the manufacturing floor. And it is, I can't have someone, you know, heavily medicated who is operating heavy machinery. That all makes sense. But can I hire a great developer to sort of help us think about our business and our industry and be more innovative? Do they have to sit in my headquarters city? And do they have to do those things? And so I think it's interesting too, that as we start to do this, how are those kind of more traditional businesses, how are they going to start to think, and how are they going to start to relook and rework their businesses?
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly a time of rethinking, which is why it's exciting to kind of get together and think through these things right now in this moment. Okay, so let's move on to what happens next, right? If you're going to remove barriers, some of the barriers we talked about are things that your company has probably used to screen candidates for all of time. So you're going to need a new plan, new ways to evaluate talent. So Jason, I'll start with you on this one. I know when we were preparing for this webinar, you mentioned the importance of transferable skills. And Robin mentioned this as well at the top of the webinar. So let's dig into that. Can you give some examples of how companies are shifting their focus to transferable skills?
Yeah, and COVID's interesting, right? Because what it has done for us is it has put many companies into survival mode. So there's been a lot of repurposing of skill sets within an organization. And what you'll end up finding, and what we have found even as a company, is we took somebody from CS and put them into almost a QA role, and all these different things that we've done. So as we talk about kind of barriers and bias, and Robin was mentioning this as well, well, if you want to do A, B, and C job, you've had to have done some version of that in the past. And then as we start kind of building our plan within an organization, we need this type of job, and we need a person who looks like this square to fit that job. And then hopefully they have the skills outside of that box to make them good. And I think with the parameter that's going to be shifting here now is I need to hire for skills, and then I'll figure out where I can put that person. And this goes back to everything else we've spoken about today. So as we're rethinking from everything from the marketing aspect of sourcing and talent acquisition, which most people don't do a very good job of, all the way through writing the job recs, again, all the way through, how do I focus on the skills that are going to be important for me as an organization that I can bring in and mold versus a particular rec that I then need to go find people to put into, and hopefully they have the skills. So Robin brought up a great example of, you know, somebody who was in customer service. Could they go work at a restaurant? Absolutely. One of the best salespeople I've ever hired to sell big enterprise chunky deals used to sell Cutco knives. Right? If you would have looked at a resume like that, those two things don't equal the same, although they're both in sales, but ends up being, you know, one of the top performers I've ever had in my career. So look at the skills and look at to me, it's almost like culture plays into this a little bit, and I may say something controversial here about culture, but I think culture is also a bit of a bias, or is becoming a bit of a bias, because companies want to hire for culture, and just like a college degree or just like other things we have talked about, I think that can become a bit of a confirmation bias and lead much more into groupthink, where what ends up saying is, I want people to fit my culture, which means I want you to be like everyone else. And then it just becomes another point of confirmation bias, where you're not bringing in innovation. You may be eliminating people who don't fit your quote unquote culture. And it's good to bring in people who are outside of your particular culture and outside of your particular skill set, like Robin was saying, to provide that influx of new culture, new ideas, new skills into the organization.
Yeah, that's great. And as you're talking, I completely agree with all of this. So my next question is, like, what is the blocker here? What is keeping companies from having this focus on transferable skills versus some of the barriers we brought up earlier? Robin, I'll ask you first what your thought is.
Yeah, I think some of this is gotten better because, as Jason mentioned, sort of with remote work, right? We kind of got this bump really fast of people working remotely. I think we've gotten a bump of thinking about agile workforces, kind of about agile workforce. So the hard part is we have these traditional organizations and we all like to kind of put them out into the boxes and who reports to who and how this works and all of this. We've started to see, I think, really innovative organizations kind of get rid of that and say, how do I just grab teams of people and how do I use technology to give me examples of people who have different skill sets to go solve a problem? And I need somebody who's got a little bit of a finance background. I want someone who's got some marketing. I want some sales, whatever those things are. And you start to pull that together. But that's a very different way of thinking. And so I think, again, COVID has made us say, oh, wow, I need to be more agile because things are going to happen in my business that can't be solved in this very traditional org structure. So I think it's a way to start to, like, we as HR professionals, need to think about kind of this structure and what are we doing and how are we organizing and are we challenging ourselves and the leaders we support to maybe think about the structure of our organizations differently so that we can bring in new and different talent along the way. I think the other thing, just to kind of tack onto what something Jason said, I thought was interesting, and I agree with, is this idea of culture fit. And I think if you're a recruiter, the question you should always ask a hiring manager or someone who's interviewed for you is when someone says they don't fit the culture, the question should be, tell me what you mean by that. Because so often, I think when I've asked that question, someone will say something that they believe is true about the culture. And the reality is, it's not even true. Like, well, we are. I didn't even know that, right? So how do you kind of come back and do that? I think it's just another way of how do you start to evaluate. You, again, as a recruiter, as an HR professional, have to ask, tell me more, help me understand those types of questions, and not just be with, okay, not a culture fit, sure, moving to the next.
Yeah,
Sure.
So go ahead, Emo. You were going to add something.
I think, and Robin, from my understanding, right, the idea of transferable skills has been around for a while. I mean, it's not just coming up now. And I think there are individual companies, individual talent acquisition folks, recruiters that have always thought this way. I think what we're talking about now is how do you do this at scale, right? How do you do this broadly as an organization? And that's where you have to have the intent first. Even though I'm a technology guy, but the product can help, but the product's not going to do it. You have to have the intent and then use the types of tools and products that will help you do that at scale. Products are out there for sure. Then one of the stories at early days when I was going into talent acquisition space overall, I had a really creative sourcer talk to me about a way he sources for roles that have to do with marketing or writing or content. He actually said he goes and looks at Yelp reviews. People who write a lot of Yelp reviews that are highly rated. He said, that's a transferable skill. They like writing. Their copy is really good. People read it and evaluate and vote on it. Great. These are people that I'm going to look for marketing roles, for copywriting roles. And, I thought that was a really amazing example of thinking outside the box, looking at transferable skills. And again, I think where we are now is if you have the right intent, then there's technology out there to try and do this at scale. Of course, we're an assessment company. One of the things we do is assessments, behavioral. We like to call them enduring skills, right? So some of our technology does help you look below the surface at underlying enduring skills that can help people be successful in certain roles.
Yeah, and I know, Connor, your organization uses some of these in your program. So maybe you could share how that plays out in your world.
Yeah, so we use OutMatch, we use WePow, and I think that our recruitment and assessment funnel is built upon the philosophy of opening up as wide a funnel as possible, as being as inclusive as we can, and eliminating these moments of bias, these like, oh, cultural fit type moments whenever we can. And that means that, we start with OutMatch. We use WePow to really standardize the way that we're asking questions and to whom. And And then we just have a very standardized process throughout, paired with a really aggressive customer acquisition strategy, right? I mean, because you have to have both. You have to have both inclusive vetting mechanisms, but you also have to really make a commitment to getting people in the door. And that often, you know, to Jason's great point, Nemo said this as well, it's ultimately good for business, but you got to put some money up front. And so what that means for us is investing in paid acquisition, where we are targeting the types of learners that we want to serve. So those are, I think, just two really important parts of it. What is your user acquisition strategy? How are you investing in the talent that you wish to have at your organization? And then what tools and processes are you using to vet them? Tools like OutMatch and WePow, which we found invaluable.
Yeah, thank you. Emo, is there anything you would add before we move on to our last question here? Just, you mentioned this applicant flow problem. So just looking at it logistically, like how is it possible to process more people, manage higher number of applicants when you start to remove some of these barriers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're starting to see, again, COVID has really helped accelerate this, but the adoption of automation in areas where it's possible. So automation makes a lot of sense in certain places and certain steps. It doesn't in others, but it's one way to help with flow, right? Applicant flow, speed, and try to remove that as a barrier. Again, Connor mentioned casting a really wide net. I think one of the challenges with that is just how do I get people through the process? So different kinds of automation tools are out there that can help in different ways. So I'll give a good example, not something we do, but if we think about trying to scale a reviewing of job descriptions to make sure that they actually don't include words that are, negative signals to certain demographics or people, there are solutions that can do that for you, right? So one way to do it manually is have a team or an individual reread every single job description to make sure you're not using biased language and to make sure the skills and things you have on there matter. Another way to do it is try to adopt solutions out there like Textio is one good example. The others that will scan those same documents and flag ones that seem to have these issues. So again, using technology is a little bit of automation and smarts to help it at certain stages. Other things we're seeing people do is finding ways to identify, okay, are there ways that can really say this group of individuals based on a number of different parameters, I can fast track them through the process, right? Can you have different systems that fast track certain groups, and then says, you know what, here's the other list that I should take a deeper look, right? The system actually tells you, you don't know enough about this group or this individual, take a little extra time. So I think we're seeing companies try and find that balance between where are things that we can fast track, but where are other areas that we need to dive a little deeper. And I think my big takeaway that I'd like to leave with people with is around metrics, right? You can't improve what you don't measure or track, right? So just having ways to see what's happening in the process across the entire funnel is really helpful to get to identify areas that you need a little bit of improvement. So investing a little bit more in understanding what is happening at scale.
Yeah, and I really like something you said when we were preparing for this webinar, which was it used to be your personal network. If you personally knew somebody, that's what would get you fast tracked through the hiring process. And now there's actually pieces of technology that can help you do that, that doesn't rely on necessarily who you happen to know or who's lucky enough to know somebody that already works in your company. All right, we're about to move into the Q&A. So if you have a question for us, please chat it in. We were talking a second ago about culture fit, and I did get a question here from Cheryl who said, how do you ensure success or retention for those you hire who don't fit the culture? So I'll just throw that out. Anyone on the panel who wants to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll go first if I can. I'll give it a little bit of a preface here. I think the next, not the next, it's already happening now. The next unintentional bias that we're seeing right now is around Gen Z and millennials, unintentionally, right? Because everyone makes jokes about it and this, and this year they're making up nearly 50% of the workforce. So I'm going to kind of parlay this into answering that question because I think it's important. we've heard this from employers or whatever. Oh, this person, because they're a millennial, which just means that they're this age group, doesn't fit into our culture because we do things this way, right? Well, guess what? If you're trying to hire that role and it's a backfill, or you're a company who's growing, just because you're doing it that way doesn't mean it's the right way. And that culture probably only exists at the executive level, by the way. If you were to survey your entire company, that culture is probably not right. So if your culture was all, let's just say, Republican, or your culture was all Democrat, is that a good thing or a bad thing as a company? I intentionally do that because we're weeks away from an election, right? You're all going to have, to Emo's point, you're all going to have this group thinking that is not going to allow for innovation. And it's going to have a ton of confirmation bias, because to Connor's point, because you're all just going to sit around nodding your head or changing your mind because you want to be part of that group. Bring somebody in who can essentially be that catalyst, who's going to change your mind, but you have to embrace that person. And what we found is a lot of the Gen Z and a lot of the millennials, even though they function very differently and they have very different motivators and very different work types and quote unquote cultures they want to fit into, they all have a pretty big voice, but it's going to be hard for them to sit around a room of 10 male white executives and voice their opinion. So as a company and as culture within an organization, we need to be open to that push, because those are the people who 10 years from now are going to make up 60 or 70% of the entire organization. Sorry,
yeah, anything else anyone wants to add before we move to the last little segment of our webinar?
I mean, I would just say really tactically, if you're sitting in an organization and they've got this person who doesn't fit the culture, I guess it's kind of depends on two ways. I think, one to think about what Jason just said is, if that person is different culturally and it's something you want more of, how do you retain them? I came out of an organization, sort of a similar thing, right? It was tried and true manufacturing. Here's how we do things. And to bring some innovation in, we brought in a kind of new college grads, and I did a reverse mentoring program. So putting a new college grad with an executive and saying, and so then the executive would start to ask questions, and like we had to kind of coach the executives to say, like, you can't always debate a point, like let the person talk maybe, but putting that in place for them to share sort of, here's my opinion and here's what I was thinking and here's why this is, or why do you, them asking the why do you do it this way to the executive and saying, well, I've seen this thing and you could try it some other way. And we started to see some new things happening and some new thinking, like all of a sudden executives like, well, hey, we should do this. And it was something that had been hard to get through, but them having that one-on-one time really started to make that change. And this, what was really cool was the energy we saw from our executive team. Like, they're wanting to be around people who were different and different ideas really started to change, which was exciting. If you've got somebody who's not a culture fit and kind of on the reverse side, but you really like their skill set, and how do you make them, then I would say kind of the same kind of thing. Put them with a buddy or a mentor and understand. So if somebody's good technically, but maybe their idea is to debate in public and your organization is, no, we debate in private, just making that as an example, but how do you help someone sort of give their ideas in a way that maybe is palatable for other people to hear that? And I'd put them again sort of with a buddy or a mentor along the way. But I'd try and ask yourself, when we say they don't fit culturally, again, what are we really saying and what does that mean?
Yeah, that's a great example. Okay, let's move to the last part here, where I really just want to go around the room to each of you and get your final thoughts. So what's your number one lesson or your best advice for removing barriers? Connor, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think that my best piece of advice is probably for senior leaders to dog food their process. So go through the process of being hired at your organization from beginning to end. And I know it seems, I don't know, it might seem like a waste of time or going overboard, but it is difficult, I think, to really understand and to like spot these things or until you experience them. And I've read there's certain parts like the interviews that are difficult to simulate that, but as much as you can, just really understand what's going on, and then I think you'll be better positioned to make changes. So yeah, experience it for yourself.
I love that. Emo, what would you say?
Yeah, I was just kind of writing this down, but I think the big thing for me is actually there's no silver bullet, right? So you got to get in the trenches, right? Commit and try things and keep trying things, right? Because it's not going to happen overnight. There are a lot of different barriers that you may or may not understand. So you have to be willing to really expose yourself, even sometimes individually, to try something that someone recommends that just you don't get. So really, there's no silver bullet. Keep trying, commit for the long haul.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Just in preparing some of these webinars we've done on diversity, I've heard some things that were surprising and really enlightening to me. So I totally agree. Just put yourself out there, hear the hard stuff, and then do your best. Jason, what would you leave us with?
Yeah, I'll probably leave this advice for every aspect of your life, but I'll meet it in here, kind of around organizations and TA, and just be a nonconformist as best as you can. Because it's always really easy to say yes and nod your head, even if you think it's not a particularly right thing. So be that squeaky wheel. Do it in a respectful way that you can make the justification that it's the right thing to do with the business. Don't just be a pain to be a pain. And if you find out that that organization doesn't value the innovation that you're bringing, go find another job.
Yeah, I like that. Robin, over to you to close us out.
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of align a little bit with what Emo and Jason and just said, and I think kind of going back to Connor is do something different, but find a champion. So I think this idea of trying and doing something different, like Connor said in the beginning, like get rid of your 4-year degree. Well, maybe you can't holistically do that for an organization, but find a hiring manager who said, I want to bring in diversity. I want to do something different. Great, I have this idea. Can we try it together? You will be surprised that when you do that, and if you do it well and have success, suddenly everybody wants to do what you're doing. And you become a leader, whether intentionally or unintentionally, because people want more of that. And that's, I think, particularly for big organizations, it's the biggest way to make change is to start kind of in these small ways. Emo said this, measure your success, shout it from the rooftops. And if you have a champion in that, they're going to be sitting at the executive level or the executive team and saying, hey, here's what I'm doing. Why aren't you doing that? And they'll start to challenge their colleagues. And it's a really kind of cool effect when you start to see that happen.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Connor. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Emo. Thank you for your time and sharing your thoughts. And thank you to everyone on the call. I hope to see you back for our next webinar.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.